Jane Fonda. To millions, she is the image of discipline. The Hollywood star with the sharp voice, the precise posture, the woman who turned fitness tapes into a global routine. An actress who stood on red carpets for decades. A political activist who refused to stay quiet. But the public image hides a different structure underneath. Behind the fame sits a childhood shaped by silence and death. Behind the confident voice was a daughter who lost her mother to suicide at 12 years old. Behind the red carpet was a young woman who grew up inside a house where affection was scarce and approval was rare. Fame came later. But fame has a cost structure. A body that worked non-stop through decades of filming. A public reputation damaged by political choices that followed her for half a century. Multiple surgeries. Artificial joints. A spine that required repair. The price of recognition is rarely emotional alone. Often it is mechanical. The body carries the load. What happens when someone spends 70 years in the spotlight and reaches 88 with a body that no longer moves the same way? And what does it mean to carry both admiration and condemnation from millions of strangers for most of a lifetime? Leave a like as a small tribute before we begin. Jane Seymour Fonda was born on December 21, 1937, in New York City. The environment around her birth was not ordinary. Her father was Henry Fonda, already a respected actor in American theater and film. Her mother, Frances Ford Seymour, came from Canadian social circles connected to wealth and influence. From the outside, the family looked stable. A famous father, a well-connected mother, 2 children growing up with resources most people never see. But inside the household, emotional distance was normal. Henry Fonda was disciplined and reserved. Friends and colleagues often described him as polite but distant. At home, that same personality translated into limited emotional warmth. Jane later described her father as someone who rarely expressed affection directly. He worked long hours. Film shoots, stage productions, travel. When he returned home, the atmosphere remained quiet. Her mother struggled with mental health issues that were rarely discussed openly in the 1940s. Depression during that era carried heavy stigma. Treatment options were limited. Therapy existed but was inconsistent and often hidden from public view. By the time Jane was a child, her mother had already experienced several emotional breakdowns. In 1949, when Jane was 12 years old, the family situation collapsed in a permanent way. Her mother was hospitalized in a psychiatric institution. Jane was told it was for rest and recovery. She was not given details. While Jane was away at boarding school, her mother took her own life. She cut her throat with a razor. The information was not given to Jane immediately. Instead, she first learned of her mother's death through a magazine article. The article described the death as a suicide. That moment created a fracture in Jane's understanding of family. The parent who had been emotionally unstable was suddenly gone. The remaining parent, her father, responded with silence. Henry Fonda rarely discussed the event afterward. Children often process trauma through explanation and conversation. Jane did not receive much of that. Instead, she internalized a conclusion common among children who lose a parent to suicide, that somehow the child failed. Years later, Jane would describe believing she had not been good enough for her mother to stay alive. This belief shaped her behavior for decades. Psychologists often refer to this type of response as performance-based approval seeking. The child attempts to earn love through achievement. Jane began focusing intensely on appearance and discipline. By her teenage years, she was already measuring her body in mirrors with extreme scrutiny. Thinness became a goal. Control over food became a method of coping. Bulimia would follow. Eating disorders during the 1950s were rarely discussed publicly. Today, research estimates that millions of people struggle with disordered eating. At that time, it remained largely invisible. Jane later admitted she lived with bulimia for more than 20 years. Food became mechanical. Binge eating followed by purging. Repetition. A private cycle that continued while she entered adulthood. After finishing school, Jane briefly attended Vassar College. The academic environment did not hold her attention for long. Instead, she began exploring acting. Her father's profession created an expectation that she might follow the same path. But the comparison also created pressure. Henry Fonda had already built a reputation as a disciplined actor with strong screen presence. His roles in films like The Grapes of Wrath established him as a serious performer. Jane feared she could not match that level of credibility. In the late 1950s, she moved to Paris for a short period and worked as a model. Modeling required precise body maintenance, reinforcing the same physical scrutiny she had already developed. The work provided income but not emotional stability. Eventually, she returned to the United States and began formal acting training with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio. Strasberg's approach focused on emotional memory. Actors were encouraged to pull real experiences from their past and use them to shape performances. For Jane, this meant revisiting childhood trauma repeatedly during training exercises. The process was intense. Some actors found liberation through the method. Others found it psychologically draining. Jane continued anyway. Her first film roles arrived in the early 1960s. Small parts at first, then slightly larger ones. But the early reaction from critics focused less on her acting and more on her appearance. Magazine covers described her as glamorous. Reviewers referred to her as a beautiful newcomer. For a young woman already struggling with body image, this attention reinforced a dangerous equation: value equals appearance. During these early years, she also entered her first marriage. In 1965, she married Roger Vadim, a French film director known for creating provocative films that challenged conservative norms. Vadim had previously been married to actress Brigitte Bardot. His reputation centered on turning actresses into international sex symbols. When Jane married him, the transformation began again. Vadim cast her in films that emphasized sexuality and visual spectacle. The most famous was Barbarella in 1968. The production required elaborate costumes that left large portions of her body exposed. The film itself became known for its surreal imagery and sexual themes. Public reaction was mixed. Some audiences embraced the film's bold visuals. Others dismissed it as shallow fantasy. Jane herself later admitted she felt uncomfortable with the image being created. But the role made her internationally recognizable. Fame was expanding. At the same time, her private life remained unstable. Her eating disorder continued. Her marriage involved long periods of separation due to filming schedules. Her sense of identity shifted constantly between actress, wife, and public figure. By the end of the 1960s, the United States was entering one of the most politically volatile periods in its modern history. The Vietnam War was escalating. College campuses filled with protests. Young Americans questioned government decisions and military involvement overseas. Jane Fonda began paying attention. Her activism started gradually, first through conversations with friends and intellectual circles, then through public appearances at anti-war events. For someone raised in a conservative Hollywood family, this shift was dramatic. Her father did not approve. Henry Fonda represented an older generation of American values: patriotism, restraint, and trust in institutions. Watching his daughter publicly criticize U.S. military actions created tension between them. The conflict between family loyalty and personal belief became one of the defining pressures of Jane's life. At the same time, her career was changing direction. She began taking more serious roles. Films like They Shoot Horses, Don't They? In 1969 displayed a darker side of her acting ability. The performance showed exhaustion, desperation, and emotional collapse. Critics noticed. It marked the beginning of a shift from glamorous roles to dramatic ones. Still, the internal struggles continued. Bulimia remained constant. She described hiding food, eating alone, then purging repeatedly. The cycle could happen multiple times in a single day. Medical research shows that long-term bulimia can damage the digestive system, teeth, and heart rhythm. At the time, Jane kept the behavior secret from most colleagues. The physical consequences would accumulate slowly. By the early 1970s, her life was moving in two directions at once. Professionally, she was gaining recognition as a serious actress. Personally, she was stepping deeper into political activism that would soon place her at the center of one of the most controversial public scandals in American celebrity history. That turning point was approaching fast, and when it arrived, it would follow her for the next 50 years. By the early 1970s, Jane Fonda was no longer just an actress trying to prove she belonged in Hollywood. She had already won major roles, and critics had begun to treat her performances with seriousness rather than curiosity. The daughter of Henry Fonda had stepped out of the shadow and built a separate reputation. But the direction of her public life was shifting into something far more volatile than film. The Vietnam War had entered its most controversial phase. American troop levels had peaked in the late 1960s, and the casualty numbers were climbing year after year. Televised footage of combat and civilian suffering began reaching American living rooms almost daily. Across the United States, protests expanded rapidly. Universities became centers of political organization. Young people marched in the streets, demanding an end to the war. Jane Fonda became one of the most visible celebrities supporting the anti-war movement. Her activism started with speeches at rallies and participation in public discussions about the war. At first, this involvement looked similar to what many public figures were doing at the time. But her approach quickly became more direct. She traveled to military bases to speak with soldiers about the war. She attended demonstrations that openly criticized American policy in Southeast Asia. She spoke in interviews with a level of bluntness that many Hollywood publicists would normally try to prevent. For an actress whose career depended on public approval, this level of political engagement carried significant risk. Hollywood studios depend on wide audiences. Political controversy narrows that audience. Agents and managers usually advise clients to stay neutral in public conflicts. Jane ignored those warnings. In 1972, she made a decision that would define her public image for the rest of her life. She traveled to North Vietnam. At that time, North Vietnam was the primary enemy government in the war. American pilots were bombing industrial targets and supply routes across the region. Many American soldiers were still fighting on the ground in South Vietnam. For an American celebrity to visit North Vietnam during active conflict was almost unheard of. During the trip, Jane met with North Vietnamese officials. She toured bomb-damaged areas. She participated in radio broadcasts criticizing American military actions. Then came the photograph. One image from the visit showed Jane Fonda sitting on a North Vietnamese anti-aircraft gun. The weapon was designed to shoot down American aircraft. The photograph circulated rapidly through newspapers and television coverage back in the United States. For many Americans, the image felt like betrayal. Military families saw a Hollywood actress sitting on the weapon system that had been used to kill American pilots. Veterans returned from the war and saw the image replayed on television. The reaction was immediate and intense. Protests formed against Jane Fonda herself. Demonstrators burned her photographs in public spaces. Radio hosts referred to her with a nickname that would stick for decades, Hanoi Jane. Some politicians even suggested she should face legal consequences for her actions. While no charges were ever filed, the idea circulated widely in media discussions. Jane later admitted she had not fully understood the symbolic damage that photograph would cause. She said she believed she was protesting war policy, not American soldiers themselves. But public perception does not operate through detailed explanations. It operates through images. And that single photograph became permanent. The backlash changed her career environment overnight. Film studios began questioning whether casting her in major productions would create boycotts. Some audiences refused to watch her films entirely. Yet at the same time, other parts of the public admired her willingness to challenge government policy. The country itself was divided over the Vietnam War, and her actions reflected that division. Instead of disappearing from public life, she continued acting. In 1971, she starred in Clute, a crime drama where she played a call girl named Bree Daniels. The role required emotional vulnerability and psychological depth. Her performance won the Academy Award for Best Actress. The contrast was striking. At the exact moment when half the country viewed her as a political traitor, she was receiving one of the highest honors in the film industry. This dual identity would follow her for decades. On one side, she was a respected actress capable of intense dramatic performances. On the other, she was a political figure surrounded by controversy. Her personal life was also changing. Her marriage to Roger Vadim ended in divorce in 1973. The relationship had lasted nearly 8 years and produced one child, Vanessa Vadim. Soon after the divorce, Jane entered a new relationship with activist Tom Hayden. Hayden was a political organizer deeply involved in left-wing movements across the United States. He had helped found the Students for a Democratic Society organization and had spent years advocating for social change. Their partnership combined politics and personal life almost completely. Jane moved deeper into activism, supporting labor unions, civil rights campaigns, and feminist causes. She traveled frequently, spoke at rallies, and used her celebrity status to draw attention to political issues. At the same time, she continued working in film. In 1978, she starred in Coming Home, a film about the physical and psychological damage experienced by Vietnam veterans returning from war. The role required her to portray a military wife confronting the reality of disabled soldiers and emotional trauma. The film resonated strongly with audiences still processing the aftermath of the war. Jane Fonda won her second Academy Award for Best Actress. 2 Oscars within a decade placed her firmly among the top performers in Hollywood. But success did not mean stability. Her eating disorder continued through much of this period. For more than 20 years, bulimia remained a daily struggle. She later described eating enormous amounts of food in secret, then purging immediately afterward. The cycle sometimes happened multiple times per day. Long-term bulimia places significant stress on the body. Electrolyte imbalance can affect heart rhythm. Repeated vomiting damages the esophagus and teeth. Digestive systems become unstable. Jane eventually began seeking treatment in the early 1980s. Recovery was gradual and incomplete at first. Eating patterns that develop over decades rarely disappear quickly. At the same time, another transformation began. In 1982, she released a home workout video called Jane Fonda's Workout. The concept seemed simple: guided aerobic exercise routines performed at home. But the timing was perfect. The early 1980s saw the rapid expansion of home video technology. VHS players were entering American households, and people were looking for new content to watch. The workout video became a massive success. Millions of copies sold worldwide. The tape introduced structured aerobic exercise to large audiences who had never followed organized fitness programs before. Jane followed the first video with additional workout releases, building an entire fitness brand. The transformation was unusual. An Academy Award-winning actress had turned herself into the face of home exercise. But the physical discipline required for the workout routines also matched her personality. She had spent years controlling her body through restrictive eating and intense self-monitoring. Now that same discipline was visible to millions of viewers performing exercises in their living rooms. The videos created enormous revenue. They also reshaped her public image. For many younger audiences, Jane Fonda became known less for Vietnam War protests and more for brightly colored leotards and aerobic routines. Yet the political past never completely disappeared. Veterans groups continued criticizing her actions from 1972. Public debates about patriotism resurfaced whenever her name appeared in news coverage. She occasionally addressed the controversy directly in interviews, admitting that some decisions during the trip to North Vietnam had been mistakes. But apologies do not erase history. The photograph of her sitting on the anti-aircraft gun continued circulating for decades. Meanwhile, her personal life shifted again. Her marriage to Tom Hayden ended in divorce in 1990 after nearly 17 years. The relationship had produced one son, Troy Garrity. The separation marked another turning point. Jane had spent most of her adult life connected to political movements through Hayden's work. After the divorce, she began moving away from constant activism and back toward a quieter lifestyle. In 1991, she married media executive Ted Turner, the founder of CNN. Turner represented a completely different world from Hayden's political organizing circles. He was a billionaire businessman, deeply embedded in corporate media structures. The marriage brought Jane into elite social environments that looked very different from the protest marches of the 1970s. During the 1990s, she largely stepped away from acting. The decision surprised many observers. She had reached a level of recognition where film offers would likely continue for years. Instead, she focused on philanthropy and personal life. But physical wear accumulated quietly over those decades. Years of performing demanding workout routines had placed stress on her joints. Long film shoots, repeated exercise demonstrations, and constant travel took their toll. By the time she approached her 70s, the body that had been displayed as a symbol of fitness began showing mechanical damage. Joint pain increased. Mobility changed. Doctors began recommending surgical interventions. And those interventions would become a regular part of her later life. The same body that had symbolized energy and control in the 1980s was entering a different stage. One defined less by performance and more by maintenance. The consequences of long public lives eventually reach everyone. For Jane Fonda, those consequences were now approaching faster with each passing year. Time does not negotiate with anyone. Not with movie stars, not with activists, not with people who spent their entire lives under bright studio lights. By the time Jane Fonda entered her 70s, the mechanical wear inside her body had already started to demand repair. The first major signals came from her joints. Decades of constant movement had left the cartilage in her knees deteriorating. Cartilage acts as the cushioning between bones. When it breaks down, bone surfaces begin grinding against each other. That grinding produces inflammation, swelling, and chronic pain. Jane eventually underwent knee replacement surgery. The damaged joint surfaces were removed and replaced with artificial components made of metal and plastic. A knee replacement changes daily life in very specific ways. Walking becomes possible again, but the joint must be treated carefully. Long periods of impact activity are discouraged. Physical therapy becomes part of the routine. But the knees were only the beginning. Over the following years, additional surgeries followed. She had hip replacement procedures. The hip joint, like the knee, is a load-bearing structure. Once the cartilage inside the joint wears away, movement becomes painful and unstable. Artificial hip components restored mobility, but each operation required months of recovery. Then came spinal issues. The human spine carries the weight of the upper body while protecting the spinal cord. Over time, the discs between vertebrae can compress or rupture. When that happens, nerves become irritated, producing pain that can radiate down the legs or into the back muscles. Jane eventually underwent spinal surgery to correct damage in her lower back. These procedures were not cosmetic adjustments. They were structural repairs to keep the body functioning. By the time she reached her 80s, she openly joked in interviews that parts of her body were bionic. But the reality underneath the humor was clear. Artificial knees, artificial hips, surgical repairs to the spine, years of physical therapy sessions to maintain mobility. Aging is often described in gentle language. In practice, it is mechanical deterioration. Muscle mass decreases. Bone density declines. Reaction time slows. Recovery from injury takes longer. Jane Fonda entered this phase of life with a body that had already experienced far more physical demand than the average person. Film sets require long hours standing under hot lights. Exercise demonstrations require constant repetition of movement patterns. Travel schedules interrupt sleep cycles. The accumulation of those factors becomes visible in later decades. Then, in 2010, another medical issue emerged. Doctors discovered a small tumor in her breast. Breast cancer is one of the most common cancers affecting women. In the United States alone, hundreds of thousands of cases are diagnosed each year. Early detection often improves survival rates significantly. Jane underwent surgery to remove the tumor. The procedure was successful, and she returned to public life soon afterward. But the event added another reminder of physical vulnerability. Health problems continued appearing in smaller ways. Skin cancers were removed in minor procedures. Routine medical screenings became a regular part of her schedule. None of these developments stopped her from working entirely. In fact, during her 70s and 80s, Jane Fonda experienced an unexpected return to acting. She appeared in films again, often playing older characters navigating family conflicts or personal reinvention. One of the most visible projects was the television series Grace and Frankie, where she starred alongside Lily Tomlin. The show ran for several seasons and introduced Jane to a younger generation of viewers who had little memory of the Vietnam War controversy or the aerobics era. On screen, she appeared energetic and composed. Off-screen, the daily routines of an 80-year-old body continued. Morning hours often begin slowly. Joints stiffen overnight. Stretching exercises become necessary just to restore normal movement. Many people in their 80s experience this pattern. The difference is that most of them are not expected to perform in front of cameras. Jane adapted by modifying physical activity. Instead of the high-impact aerobic routines she once demonstrated on video, she shifted to slower strength training and balance exercises. These routines focus on preserving muscle function rather than building new athletic performance. Falls represent one of the most serious risks for elderly individuals. Balance training helps reduce that risk. Her workouts now revolve around controlled movement rather than speed. Daily schedules also include medication management. Aging bodies often require treatments for blood pressure, inflammation, or other chronic conditions. While Jane has not publicly detailed every prescription, regular medical supervision is common for individuals in their late 80s. Sleep patterns also change with age. Many elderly adults experience lighter sleep cycles and wake up earlier in the morning. These small mechanical changes define daily life far more than public appearances. Yet public perception often freezes celebrities in earlier decades. Many people still imagine Jane Fonda as the athletic instructor from the 1980s, wearing bright workout clothing and leading energetic routines. The physical reality today is very different. Walking requires attention to joint alignment. Long periods of standing can produce back discomfort. Travel schedules must be carefully planned to allow recovery time. Despite those limitations, she continues speaking publicly about issues that matter to her. Environmental activism became one of her central focuses in recent years. She participated in climate demonstrations and even allowed herself to be arrested during peaceful protests in Washington, D.C. At an age when many individuals withdraw from public life entirely, she remained visible. But the past never completely releases its hold. The Vietnam War controversy still appears in interviews. Veterans occasionally confront her during public events. The nickname, Hanoi Jane, still circulates in certain circles more than 50 years later. Jane has acknowledged the mistake of sitting on the anti-aircraft gun during her trip to North Vietnam. She has expressed regret for the pain that image caused many military families. Yet history cannot be edited. For some people, her activism represents courage. For others, it represents betrayal. Carrying both interpretations simultaneously has been one of the defining conditions of her public life. Then, in 2022, another serious health announcement arrived. Jane revealed she had been diagnosed with non-Hodgkin lymphoma, a form of cancer that affects the lymphatic system. The lymphatic system helps regulate immune responses and remove waste from tissues. When lymphoma develops, abnormal white blood cells begin multiplying uncontrollably. Treatment typically involves chemotherapy or targeted drug therapies designed to stop the growth of these cells. Chemotherapy places enormous stress on the body. Fatigue becomes common. Immune defenses weaken. Hair loss and nausea are frequent side effects. Jane approached treatment with a level of openness unusual for many celebrities. She posted updates about her condition, explaining the process and acknowledging the fear involved. By 2023, she announced that the cancer had gone into remission. Remission does not always mean permanent cure, but it indicates that detectable cancer cells have been reduced to extremely low levels. The experience added another chapter to the long list of physical battles her body had already faced. Now, at 88 years old, the daily structure of life is quieter. Film schedules are rare. Travel is limited. Much of her time is spent at home, reading, communicating with family, and maintaining light physical activity to preserve mobility. Her children and grandchildren remain central to her life. The young woman who once believed she had to earn love through performance now speaks openly about the importance of emotional connection. Looking back across nearly 9 decades reveals a pattern that few people experience in such public detail. A childhood marked by a mother's suicide. 20 years battling bulimia in secret. Political decisions that created lifelong controversy. 2 Academy Awards. Global fame through fitness videos. Multiple surgeries replacing damaged joints. Cancer diagnoses and recovery. And the quiet daily work of aging in a body that has been pushed for nearly a century. Fame often hides the ordinary mechanics of human life. Underneath the awards and headlines, Jane Fonda's story is also a record of the same processes that shape everyone. Childhood trauma, physical wear, illness, recovery, and the gradual slowing that arrives with old age. The difference is that most people experience those stages privately. She experienced them with the entire world watching.